They called us amusing, not dangerous, not powerful, not even important. Amusing. The way an adult might smile at a child swinging a wooden stick and pretending it was a sword. That was humanity in the eyes of the Galactic Conclave. A young species stumbling into the stars with more courage than wisdom. Too emotional. Too impulsive. Too inexperienced to be taken seriously. The great civilizations of the galaxy had existed for thousands of years before humanity ever left its home system. They looked at us and saw a brief spark in an ancient universe. A curiosity. A novelty. Something interesting to observe. Not something to fear. My name is Dar Vasquez. I am 61 years old. I served 32 years in the Terran Defense Fleet, and since retiring, I have spent my life documenting the events that changed galactic history forever. The events that taught the Conclave a lesson they would never forget. The day humanity stopped being patient. I was born aboard Ares Station, a colony orbiting Mars. That meant I grew up looking at Earth through reinforced glass. A distant blue sphere hanging in the darkness. Beautiful. Fragile. Home. There is something strange about growing up away from the world that created your species. You learn very early how vast the universe truly is. You learn how insignificant one person can feel beneath endless stars. But you also learn something else. You learn that survival has very little to do with size. Small things survive because they adapt, because they endure, because larger things often fail to notice them until it's too late. My mother understood that better than anyone. She worked maintenance on the station's outer hull and possessed the kind of wisdom that never appeared in textbooks. When I was young, she used to tell me something I never forgot. The most dangerous advantage a small person has is being underestimated. At the time, I thought she was talking about life, about bullies, about politics, about people. Years later, I realized she had unknowingly described the entire strategy of the human race. Because for nearly 3 centuries, humanity allowed the galaxy to underestimate us. We let them believe we were harmless. We let them think we were naive. We smiled. We traded. We cooperated. And all the while, they never understood what they were actually looking at. The Galactic Conclave discovered humanity 287 years ago. Their arrival should have been the greatest moment in our history. For most species, first contact was a celebration, a beginning. For humanity, it became a warning. Though none of us understood that at the time. The Conclave arrived with ships larger than cities and technology that seemed indistinguishable from magic. Their ambassadors welcomed us warmly. Their diplomats offered friendship. Their historians promised knowledge. And behind every smile was the quiet certainty that humanity would never matter. We were simply the newest species, the youngest voice in a room filled with ancient powers, a race that would follow rather than lead, a civilization that would adapt to the galaxy instead of changing it. The Conclave believed they understood humanity. That was their first mistake. Their second mistake was believing humanity cared whether it was respected. And their final mistake was giving humanity enough time to prepare. Because history is filled with powerful empires that laughed at small nations. History is also filled with the graves of those empires. The Conclave remembered the first lesson. They forgot the second. We did not. They arrived in our solar system in ships so large that they blocked sunlight from reaching entire continents when they passed overhead. Their technology was centuries beyond ours. Their civilization was ancient when humans were still painting animals on cave walls. And they looked at us, our little blue planet, with our little nuclear rockets and our little political arguments. And they smiled the way you smile at a puppy that tries to growl. They offered us membership in their community. They offered us medicine that could cure every disease on Earth, materials that could end poverty, energy sources that could power our civilization for 10,000 years. In exchange, they asked for one thing. They called it the containment doctrine. And it was presented to us as a formality, a simple boundary arrangement. Humanity would remain within a bubble of space 40 light-years in diameter. We could colonize within that boundary. We could develop within that boundary. But we would not expand beyond it until the Conclave decided we were ready. Our leaders signed it inside 3 months. I am not angry at the people who signed it. I understand why they did. Earth had been through centuries of resource shortages and environmental collapse. Billions of people were hungry. The deal the conclave offered could fix all of that. Saying no would have been very hard to explain to a child who had not eaten that day. But there were people even then who read the fine print, who noticed that the doctrine had no end date, no criteria for readiness, no appeal process. It was not a temporary arrangement. It was a cage with a very comfortable interior, and the species that put us in it never intended for the door to open. I was 17 years old and sitting in a classroom on the Mars station when I first heard the name of the Zeeth hegemony. Our teacher pulled up a star map and pointed to a cluster of systems just beyond our 40 light-year boundary. She told us that the Zeeth were a member species of the conclave, that they were known for aggressive territorial expansion, and that several other species had filed formal complaints about their behavior. The conclave had responded with letters. The conclave, I would learn, was very good at letters. I joined the Earth Defense Corps at 19. By that point, the human military was largely ceremonial. We had ships, yes. We had training programs and uniforms and medals and traditions that went back centuries. But our actual capacity for interstellar conflict had been quietly downgraded over the decades following the containment doctrine. Why would we need a real military? The conclave kept the peace. The conclave handled threats. We were protected. What nobody said out loud, but what every soldier in every barracks understood, was that the conclave did not protect us out of kindness. They contained us out of caution. There is a difference, and it matters. During my early years of service, the thing soldiers whispered about most was not the Zay, though we all knew about the raids by then. Small colony ships going dark near the boundary edge. Supply vessels found drifting without crews. The conclave's official position was that these incidents were under investigation. Their unofficial position was that humans should stay well inside the boundary and stop sending ships so close to the edge. What soldiers whispered about was something else. A program. A project so classified that it did not have a name in any file that any ordinary soldier could access. You would hear things in mess halls, in the spaces between assignments, in the long, quiet hours of night watch. Someone's cousin had been recruited for something and never came back to regular service. Someone's commanding officer had disappeared into a reassignment that led nowhere traceable. There was a ghost in the machine of the human military, and nobody who knew what it was would say so out loud. We called it the Vault because someone had to call it something. For 11 years, I served, transferred, trained, and watched the Zeeth raids get worse, and the conclave's letters get longer, and more carefully worded, and less useful. I watched colony families buried in memorial services that the conclave attended out of diplomatic courtesy, saying the right things with the right expressions, while doing exactly nothing. I watched our political leaders press for action and receive summits. I attended 2 of those summits as a security escort. The food was excellent. The results were not. Then came the Constance. The ESV Constance was a civilian colony transport. 4,212 people on board, mostly families, teachers, farmers, medical workers, children. It was traveling from our outer colony at Kepler Station toward a new settlement at the edge of our authorized zone. It never arrived. The Zeeth did not disable it. They did not board it. There were no survivors to interview. No escape pods recovered. The Constance simply stopped transmitting. And when a search vessel reached its last known location, they found debris spread across 6,000 kilometers of empty space. I was 31 years old. I had been in uniform for 12 years. I had watched raids and memorials and letters and summits and negotiations and hearings and statements of deep concern. And I sat in the briefing room where the commander of the Earth Defense Corps read us the casualty count. And I felt something shift inside me, the way the ground shifts before something underground finally gives way. The conclave's response came 4 days later. It was a formal statement of condemnation. It called the attack a grave violation of conclave transit norms. It announced a review committee. It expressed profound sympathy to the families of those lost. The committee had a projected timeline of 18 months. I remember the silence in that briefing room after the statement was read aloud. Not the silence of people who had nothing to say, the silence of people who had too much to say, and were each individually deciding whether to say it. Our commanding officer, a tall, quiet man named Colonel Owen Harrow, folded the statement once, then again, then set it on the table in front of him. He looked at each of us in turn, He said nothing. He did not need to. 3 weeks after the loss of the Constants, I received a new assignment. The orders gave no posting location, no unit designation, no mission description. They simply told me to report to a transport bay at 400 and to tell no one where I was going. I did not know it at the time, but I was not the only one. 40 soldiers drawn from every branch of the Earth Defense Corps received the same orders that week. None of us knew each other. None of us knew where we were going. We were going to meet the thing that the human race had been quietly building while the galaxy was busy being amused by us. We were going to meet the war gods, and the galaxy, which had laughed at us for nearly 3 centuries, was about to realize that patience is not the same as surrender. That silence is not the same as weakness, and that a species which survived 10,000 years of its own worst impulses before reaching the stars might just know a thing or two about how to fight. That was the last time anyone in the galaxy made the mistake of thinking our restraint was weakness. The transport had no windows. I noticed that immediately. Military transports usually have at least a few observation panels, narrow strips of reinforced composite that let you see where you are going, or at least confirm that you are still in space, and not inside a very large, very expensive cargo container. This one had none. The walls were smooth, the lighting was steady and white, and the 39 other soldiers who sat in the passenger bay with me were all doing the same thing I was doing, which was sitting very still and saying very little. We had been in the air for 6 hours before anyone spoke. The person who broke the silence was a young man named Corporal Adam Price, 23 years old, fresh out of advanced tactical training, who looked at the sealed door at the front of the bay and said quietly, "Does anyone else feel like they just signed up for something they do not entirely understand?" Several people laughed. It was the kind of laughter that does not mean something is funny. It means that something is nervous and needs to move. I had been watching the group since we boarded. Old habit. 32 years in uniform. Teaches you to read rooms. Red people read the particular weight of silence that settles over soldiers when they know something is coming, but do not know what shape it will take. What I saw in that transport bay was not fear. It was something more complicated. These were experienced soldiers, people who had served through raids and memorials, and the long grinding frustration of watching the conclave do nothing. They were not afraid of danger. They were afraid of hope, because hope, when it is disappointed, is much harder to carry than simple despair. The transport docked somewhere I did not recognize. No announcements. The door simply opened, and a woman in civilian clothes stepped through and told us to follow her. What I saw on the other side of that door is something I have described in official testimony 3 times, and each time I struggled to make the scale of it real to the people listening. You have to understand that I had been inside military installations my entire adult life. I had seen orbital docks and underground command centers and training facilities carved into the hearts of asteroids. I thought I understood what large-scale military construction looked like. I was wrong. The facility was built inside a hollowed asteroid, approximately 40 kilometers across. The outer shell had been left intact, which is why no sensor sweep had ever flagged it. From the outside, it looked like every other chunk of rock drifting in the outer belt. On the inside, it was a city. Docking bays large enough to hold ships I could not name. Workshop floors that stretched so far that the far walls were lost in the distance. Corridors lit with clean white light, busy with people in both military and civilian uniforms, all moving with the focused, quiet efficiency of people who have been working toward a single goal for a very long time. We walked for 20 minutes before we reached the chamber where the briefing took place. It was a large circular room, tiered like an old lecture theater, and when we took our seats, a woman walked to the center of the floor and looked up at us without any particular expression on her face. She was perhaps 60, gay-haired, with the posture of someone who had spent decades being the most prepared person in any room she walked into. Her name was Director Helen Marsh, and she was the head of a program that officially did not exist. She did not waste time. 81 years ago, she said, a small group of military strategists and cognitive scientists sat in a room not unlike this one and asked a question that nobody else in the human government was willing to ask. The question was this: if the containment doctrine ever fails, if the conclave proves unwilling or unable to protect human interests, what would it take for humanity to defend itself against species that have centuries of technological advantage over us? Nobody moved. The answer they reached was not more ships. More ships can be built by anyone with sufficient resources. The answer was not better weapons. Better weapons can be copied and countered. The answer was judgment. Specifically, the kind of judgment that comes from having absorbed every tactical lesson that the human race has ever learned in every conflict across all of recorded history, and being able to apply that knowledge faster and more precisely than any individual commander ever could. She let that sit for a moment. What we built, she said, we call the War Gods program, and tonight you are going to meet them. The chamber doors opened on both sides, and they walked in. There were 12 of them in that first group, though I would learn that 144 existed in total. They move the way large things move, when they are controlled by something that understands exactly how much space they take up carefully, precisely, without any wasted motion. They stood roughly 3 meters tall in their operational frames, armored in a matte dark material that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But what stopped my breath was not their size, it was their faces. Each war god had a face visible through a reinforced viewport at the front of the helmet. Not a screen showing a generated image, an actual human face, real living behind the armor. I would learn later that the biological component of each war god was a human brain, preserved and enhanced, connected to the AI systems, through a bonding process that took years to complete. The face you saw was the original person who had volunteered for the program. They were still in there, still human, still themselves. The one that stopped in front of me was designated Ares 7. He was looking at me with the calm, steady attention of someone who was genuinely interested in what they were seeing. His face was that of a man who appeared to be in his late 30s, strong-featured, with dark eyes that held a quality I had difficulty noming at first. It was not intelligence exactly, though the intelligence was obvious. It was weight, the weight of someone who has read every account of every battle ever fought, and carries all of it inside them all the time. He said, "You are Staff Sergeant Dar Vasquez. Mars Station, 12 years of service, 3 combinations for field judgment." He paused. "The Constance families, did they receive any compensation from the Conclave Committee?" I said, "No." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. Anger is cleaner than grief." Director Marsh had not been exaggerating about the scale of what had been built. Over the next 48 hours, we were given full access to the facility and to the records of the program. What I learned over those 2 days rearranged something fundamental in how I understood the human race. For 81 years, in secret, in facilities scattered across the outer belt and beyond sensor range of any conclave monitoring station, humanity had been preparing, not recklessly, not out of aggression, with the cold, methodical patience of a species that understood it might one day need to survive on its own, and had decided to be ready when that day came. 14,000 warships had been constructed, and were currently in holding positions in deep space beyond any scan. The ships were not the brutish, overwhelming kind that you might expect from a civilization building toward war. They were precise, designed with the same philosophy as the war gods themselves, for targeted, controlled, overwhelming effect in specific scenarios. Each vessel carried tactical systems that had been developed and tested in simulations running continuously for 3 decades. The weapons research had been done on sublight vessels that never came within range of conclave sensors. The material science, the propulsion systems, the communication technology, all of it had been advanced independently, quietly, without asking permission. Because asking permission would have meant admitting what we were doing, and what we were doing was surviving. There were 44 war gods assigned to strategic command. 40 were assigned to direct tactical operations. The remaining 60 served in roles I did not fully understand at the time: advisory positions, logistics optimization, intelligence processing. All 144 were conscious, fully aware, each carrying within them a version of every war ever documented in human history, every strategy, every failure, every hard lesson purchased at enormous cost by someone who died so that the lesson could be learned. On the 3rd day, Director Marsh brought the 40 of us together again. She told us that we had been selected not as soldiers in the traditional sense. We were to serve as witnesses and recorders. The war gods would conduct operations. We would document them officially for the Galactic Archive, because when this was over, the record would matter. How humanity fought would matter as much as whether humanity won. That was the moment I understood what made our approach different from every aggressive species that had come before us in this galaxy. We were not going to fight to conquer. We were not going to fight to punish. We were going to fight to be seen clearly and accurately by every watching eye in the galaxy. We were going to make sure that what we were was understood. Ares 7 and I had our first real conversation that evening. He had requested that I be assigned as his official witness, which I was told was unusual. War gods did not typically request specific personnel. I asked him why he had chosen me. He said, "Because when I told you that anger is cleaner than grief, you did not argue with me or tell me. That was a concerning thing to say. You just nodded. That means you understand the difference between productive emotion and corrosive emotion. I need someone who understands that difference, because what we are about to do will produce a great deal of both, in a great many people, and the record needs to be kept by someone who can tell them apart." I asked him if he was ready. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "I have the complete tactical memory of every general who ever won a war, and several who lost them. What I have learned from the ones who lost is more useful than what I learned from the ones who won. I am as ready as it is possible to be." 3 days later, the Secretary General of the United Earth Government walked into the Geneva Command Center and spoke the 11 words that activated the doctrine of remembered fire. I was not in that room, but I heard the words later on the recording, and I will tell you that they were not dramatic. They were not a declaration of war or a speech about justice. They were simply an authorization code spoken into a microphone in a quiet voice by a woman named Elena Webb, who had been carrying the weight of this decision for 4 years. What followed those 11 words was not an explosion of activity. It was the opposite, the kind of stillness that comes just before something enormous begins to move. In facilities across the outer belt, in deep space holding positions aboard 14,000 warships that had been waiting in silence, systems came online. War gods who had been in low-activity states became fully present. Crews who had been running maintenance and waiting for years received a single notification: the authorization had been given. I stood next to Ares 7 on the command deck of our vessel as the fleet assembled in silence around us. Ship after ship materializing out of deep space holds, taking formation with a precision that was almost beautiful. Outside the viewports, the stars were the same stars they had always been. They did not know yet what was about to change. Ares 7 looked at me once, just before we jumped. He said, "They gave us 300 years to prepare. That was their first mistake." I did not ask what their second mistake was. I already knew. Their second mistake was thinking that everything we had built was about anger. It was not about anger. It was about something much older, much steadier, and much harder to stop. It was about the fact that humans remember every single thing that was ever done to us. Every colony ship that went dark, every family buried without answers, every letter from a committee, every summit with excellent food and no results, every year of quiet, dignified, patient endurance, while the galaxy watched and waited to see if we would simply accept our cage forever. We remembered all of it, and now it was time to show the galaxy what that memory had built. They had never seen anything like it. I want to be precise about this because precision matters when you are writing history. The Zethman was not a weak power. They had been a member of the Galactic Conclave for over 4 centuries. They controlled 11 star systems, operated a fleet of roughly 600 warships, and had successfully absorbed or displaced 3 smaller civilizations in the past 200 years, without any meaningful consequence from the Conclave or anyone else. They were large, they were organized, and they were confident in the way that things become confident when nothing has ever seriously challenged them. Their confidence lasted approximately 4 minutes after we arrived at Thresh Station. Thresh Station was the Zeeth's primary naval staging ground, a deep space installation positioned just beyond the edge of our 40 light-year containment boundary. It was from this station that the raids on human colony ships had been coordinated. The Constance and 37 other vessels before it had been targeted from here. 312 Zeth warships were docked or holding in its vicinity when our fleet came out of transit. We outnumbered them by more than 40 to 1. I was standing on the observation deck of the command vessel, directly behind Ares 7, when the transit completed. The starfield shifted, settled, and there it was, Thresh Station, enormous and angular, lit from within, its docking rings full of warships that had not yet understood what they were looking at. For a moment, nothing happened. The Zet systems were probably processing the incoming data, trying to count us, trying to make sense of a human fleet that was not supposed to exist. Ares 7 did not give them time to decide what to do with that information. What he did next is the thing I have been asked about most in the years since. Every military historian, every tactical analyst, every political philosopher who has written about what happened at Thresh Station always wants to know the same thing. They want to know why he did not fire immediately. We had overwhelming advantage. A conventional commander in that position might have ended the engagement in minutes with maximum force. Instead, Ares 7 spent the first 4 minutes broadcasting. Not threats, not demands, explanations. In those 4 minutes, on every open channel used by the Zeth fleet, and on 17 frequencies monitored by conclave relay stations, Ares 7 broadcast the following. A complete record of every documented raid conducted by Zeth forces against human vessels over the past 40 years, with dates, coordinates, vessel names, and casualty counts. The complete record of every formal complaint filed by the human government with the conclave. The complete record of every conclave response. The full passenger manifest of the Constants. 4,212 names read in full, which took most of those 4 minutes by itself. When the last name had been read, Ares 7 said simply, "We remember all of them, and we are here to make sure the galaxy remembers them too." Then he gave the order. I have to explain what happened next carefully, because what happened next was what made everything after it possible. When Ares 7 said, "Give the order," I assumed in the half-second before it happened that I was about to witness the destruction of Thresh Station and every ship around it. I was wrong. The order was not destruction, it was control. Every ship in our fleet moved simultaneously, a coordination that no human commander with conventional communication systems could have achieved. But that Ares 7 managed because he was processing tactical information from all 14,000 vessels simultaneously. They moved to block. They moved to surround. They created a perfect containment sphere around Thresh Station at a distance that made it impossible for the Zet fleet to maneuver without entering our weapons range, but they did not fire. The Zet fleet tried to respond. Several warships attempted to break through the containment. What happened to those ships was not destruction. Each one was targeted by 3 of our vessels simultaneously, struck by weapons designed specifically for this purpose. Precision systems that disabled propulsion and weapons without breaching the hull. The ships lost power. They drifted. Their crews were unharmed. Every ship that tried to fight, we disabled. Every ship that held position, we left alone. Within 40 minutes, 209 Zet warships had been disabled and were drifting inside our containment sphere. The remaining 103 had not moved. The station itself had not been touched. Ares 7 then did something that I, watching from 3 meters away, did not anticipate. He identified the command vessel of the Zeth Fleet Admiral, a ship called the Vorath, and instead of disabling it, he began hurting it. Using 3 of our vessels as a kind of slow, patient pressure, he guided the Vorath through the drifting wreckage of its own fleet, pushing it gently, but irresistibly toward a specific position. A position I realized after a moment that placed it in direct broadcast alignment with the largest conclave relay station in the sector. The Vorath could not jump without going through our ships. It could not fire without being disabled. And it was positioned perfectly so that every transmission it made would be received in real time by a conclave monitoring station that served 14 member civilizations. Ares 7 then opened a direct channel to the Vorath. He said, "Your fleet is contained. Your crews are safe. No lives have been taken. You will now transmit a full account of Zeth military operations against human vessels over the past 40 years, including command authorizations, operational orders, and mission logs. You will transmit on open channel on all frequencies monitored by conclave relay stations. You will begin in 60 seconds. There was a pause. The Zeth Admiral's response came after 20 seconds. I will not repeat exactly what he said, because some of it was in Zes, which takes time to translate. But the substance of it was a refusal, accompanied by several statements about the inadequacy of humanity as a military power, and several more about what the conclave would do to us for this action. Ares 7 waited until he finished. Then he said, "You have 40 seconds remaining." The Vorth began transmitting at the 30-second mark. I have been in enough tense situations to recognize when something shifts, when the weight moves from one side to the other. As I stood on that observation deck and watched the Zeth Fleet Admiral transmit his own forces' operational record of 40 years of raids on civilian vessels, I felt the exact moment when the balance of this particular corner of the galaxy changed, the moment when something that had been assumed to be permanently true was quietly revised. The transmission lasted nearly 2 hours. It covered not just the operations we had documented, but several we had not known about. It covered the command decisions that had been made, the internal communications that had accompanied them, the fact that certain conclave officials had been quietly informed and had quietly chosen to take no action. That last part, I learned later, was what genuinely alarmed the conclave. Not that humanity had a fleet, not that we had defeated the Z without a single loss of life on either side. What alarmed them was that the transmission contained evidence that certain members of the conclave had known about the raids and said nothing. That changed the story significantly. It meant this was not a rogue species acting outside galactic norms. It meant the norms themselves were compromised. After the transmission ended, Ares 7 turned to me for the first time since the engagement began. He had been completely still for over 2 hours, processing, directing, monitoring, a stillness that was not like human stillness, but had its own particular quality. He said, "Are you getting all of this?" I said, "I was." I had been recording continuously. He said, "Good. History needs to be told correctly, or it tends to repeat." I asked him how he felt. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I feel the weight of every name on that manifest. I will feel it for as long as I exist. I think that is appropriate." I did not know what to say to that. I had come to Thresh Station expecting to witness a military operation. What I had witnessed was something harder to categorize. It was a statement, a demonstration with such precision and such restraint that it communicated something no weapon alone could have communicated. We were not here to conquer. We were not here to punish in the way that produces more cycles of punishment. We were here to be seen for what we were, with complete clarity by everyone watching. And everyone was watching. Within 6 hours of the Vorath's transmission, the conclave had convened an emergency session. Within 12 hours, 3 member species had publicly withdrawn their endorsement of the containment doctrine. The Zathke had gone completely silent on all diplomatic channels. An envoy ship appeared at the edge of our 40-light-year boundary 2 days after the engagement. It was a conclave vessel, one of the large diplomatic ships that had attended the memorials and eaten the excellent food at the summits. It stopped at the boundary line and transmitted a single message requesting communication. Then it waited. It did not advance. It occurred to me, watching the sensor readout showing that motionless ship sitting at our boundary, that this was the first time in the 287 years since the conclave had found us, that one of their vessels had waited for permission to enter our space, rather than simply declaring the terms under which they would interact with us. Small thing, enormous thing. Ares 7 noticed me looking at the readout. He said they are deciding how to talk to something they do not have a category for. I asked what he meant. He said they have categories for primitive species. They have categories for dangerous species. They have categories for species that are powerful but manageable. They do not have a category for a species that built something like this and chose at the moment of maximum advantage to preserve every life on the other side. That does not fit any model they have. That is not how power has ever behaved in this galaxy. And they do not know what to do with something that behaves in a way they cannot predict from experience. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about every military culture humanity had ever produced, every general who had ever written about restraint as a form of strength, every tradition that held that how you fought revealed who you were, every hard lesson from our own history about the difference between winning a battle and winning what came after. The conclave had spent 3 centuries afraid of what humans would do when pushed too far. They had built their entire policy toward us around that fear, and what we had done at the moment of maximum push was disable ships instead of destroying them, broadcast evidence instead of making threats, and stand at the boundary of overwhelming force and deliberately, consciously, choose not to use all of it. That was what they did not have a category for. Not because it was gentle, because it was controlled. Because control exercised at that scale by something that had been given every reason to be otherwise implied, a depth of self-standing that the conclave had never considered us capable of. I wrote in my field record that night, they had expected monsters. What terrified them more was that we sent something that knew exactly how much force to use and had the discipline not to use more. I still believe that is the most accurate summary of what happened at Thresh Station. But it took me many more weeks to understand that the most significant part of this story was not the battle. It was not the broadcast. It was not even the fleet. The most significant part was what I was about to learn about the beings who had fought it. There is a kind of quiet that settles over a ship when the action is over, and the outcome is clear. But the consequences have not yet arrived. It is not a comfortable quiet. It is the quiet of a held breath of people, waiting to see what the world looks like now that something has changed in it permanently. I was spending most of my time on the command deck, not because I was required to be there, but because that was where Ares 7 was, and my assignment was to document him, and also, if I am honest, because I found that being near him helped me think. He had a quality that was difficult to describe. When you stood near something that carried the full weight of human history inside it, and had just chosen at the moment of greatest power to be merciful, you felt the significance of that choice in a way that changed how you looked at everything else. We had been in holding position for 9 days. The Z disarmament was proceeding. The Conclave envoy ship was still sitting at our boundary waiting. Diplomatic communications were being handled by Earth's political teams, not by the military. We were in the language of operational orders in a standby phase. What that meant in practice was that for the first time in years, Ares 7 had something approaching unstructured time. The first thing he did with it surprised me. He asked if he could read my personal field journal. I said it was not particularly interesting. He said, "You write in it every day. That means you are processing something. I would like to know what." I gave him access. He read the entire journal in approximately 4 minutes, which is not as unsettling as it sounds once you understand how his mind processes text. He was quiet for a while after. Then he said, "You describe the Conclave envoy as waiting for permission. That is not the word they would use for what they are doing." I asked what word they would use. He said, "Recalibrating." They are not waiting for permission. They are revising their entire model of what humans are, and what that means for every decision they have made about us for 2 centuries. That takes time. It should take time. Rushing that process would be a mistake. I wrote that down. That night we talked for a long time, and I learned things about the War Gods program that I had not been told in the official briefing. Not secrets exactly, more like the parts of the truth that are too complicated to include in a briefing, but that matter when you are trying to understand what you are dealing with. The bonding process, the integration of human mind and AI system, took on average 6 years. The volunteers who entered the program knew they were not coming out unchanged. What they did not fully know in advance was how complete the change would be. The tactical AI systems that bonded with them did not replace their personalities. They expanded them. Each war god retained everything of the person they had been, their memories, their values, their emotional responses, and added to that foundation the complete accumulated tactical knowledge of human military history. What that meant in practice was that Ares 7 simultaneously contained the young man he had been before the process, a person named Owen. I learned this quietly, and felt I should keep it carefully, and something much larger. He remembered his childhood. He remembered his first day in the program. He also remembered Gettysburg, the Somme, Thermopylae, every campaign ever documented in human records, not as history he had studied, but as experience he had integrated. It was all equally present for him, all equally real. I asked him once how he kept himself organized inside that much memory. He said, "The same way you do, by knowing which things matter now." What I had not understood, and what I slowly came to understand over those 9 days, was the cost of what had been built. Not in resources, in terms of what had been asked of the people inside those frames. Ares 7 was the 7th war god ever completed. He had been in the program for over 40 years. In that time, he had never left the program's facilities. He had never had a conversation that was not in some way operational. He had never had a relationship that was not in some way a function of his role. He had spent 40 years preparing for something, waiting for something, being the most lethal and most restrained thing humanity had ever created. And in all that time, nobody had asked him if he was all right. He asked me one evening what my mother had been like. I told him. She had been a small, decisive woman who grew plants in the station's hydroponic bay and had opinions about everything, and laughed loudly, and was completely certain that the people she loved were worth whatever effort they required. She had died 11 years ago. I still thought about her most days. Ares 7 was quiet for a while. Then he said, "I was 19 when I entered the program. I do not remember my family well. The integration process does not damage personal memory, but it does change the way early memories feel. They become less vivid, more like reading about something that happened to someone else. He paused. I have never had a mother in any sense that felt real. I wanted you to know that I understand intellectually what that relationship is. I have read 10,000 accounts of it, but I would like to know what it actually felt like to have one. I do not think I have ever been more aware of the complexity of what we had built than I was in that moment. We had created beings capable of managing fleets of 14,000 vessels simultaneously. Beings whose tactical judgment was so fine that they could disable 300 ships without a single crew fatality. Beings who understood the full sweep of human history and could apply it in real time to problems that had never existed before. And we had not thought carefully enough about what it was like to be those beings. On the 6th day of the standby phase, something happened that I did not witness directly, but that was recorded and that I read in the official after-action log that evening. One of the other war gods, Tasis III, had been assigned to oversee a patrol operation along the boundary edge. Her patrol had identified a conclave vessel that appeared to be a medical support ship moving slowly along a course that brought it near the position of a group of Zeeth civilian evacuation vessels that had left Thresh Station during the standby period. Tasis III had been operating under an active strike authorization for any conclave or Zet vessels that crossed a defined boundary perimeter. The medical vessel crossed that perimeter. She did not fire. Her field report submitted 40 minutes after the incident was 3 words: not worth it. When the full report came in, it explained her reasoning. She had identified medical personnel aboard the conclave vessel by their transmission signatures. She had assessed that the Zeeth civilian vessels in the area were carrying non-combatants. She had determined that the medical vessel was providing aid to those civilians, and that firing on it would have served no strategic purpose that could not be achieved through other means. None of this was in her orders. Her orders were clear, and she had chosen not to follow them in this specific case, because her judgment overrode them. The strike authorization she had declined to use was reviewed by Director Marsh within the hour. The assessment was that Themis III had made the correct decision. What nobody had anticipated was that the Conclave envoy ship, still sitting at our boundary, had been monitoring the entire situation. They had watched a war god receive an order and independently choose not to execute it because the target included medical personnel serving civilian refugees. They had watched the most powerful military asset humanity had ever produced exercise independent moral judgment in the middle of an operation. The envoy ship sent a new message that evening. It was addressed not to the Earth government but directly to Tasis III. It asked for a direct communication. She agreed. The conversation lasted 4 hours, and I was not present for it, but the transcript exists and I have read it many times. The conclave envoy, a diplomat of the Sheth species named something unpronounceable in any human language, but who asked to be called counselor, asked Thais a series of questions. Some were tactical, some were philosophical. Toward the end, counselor asked her why she had made the choice she made. What specific value had led her to override the authorization? Tasis III said, because they needed help, and they were not my enemy. The counselor was quiet for a long time. Then they said, in 400 years of conclave service, I have attended many negotiations. I have sat across from many different kinds of minds. I do not think I have ever heard a simpler or more complete moral statement than the one you just made. I read that transcript on the 7th day, and I thought about what Director Marsh had said in the circular briefing room about how what we were, and how we fought, would matter as much as whether we won. I thought about the 40 soldiers who had been selected as witnesses and recorders. And I thought about the particular kind of witness I was becoming. Not a recorder of battles, a recorder of character. Because what was happening out here in this pocket of space between Thresh Station and the conclave boundary was not really a military story. It had started as one, but it had become something else. A question being asked by a galaxy that had decided it knew what humanity was, about whether that assessment had ever been correct. Ares 7 told me on the 8th day that he was afraid of something. I was so surprised by the statement that I asked him to repeat it. He said, when this is over, some people will argue that we are too powerful to exist freely. They will argue that beings like me, capable of what I am capable of, cannot be trusted with autonomy. They will make that argument in careful, reasonable language, and they will mean it sincerely, and I understand why they would make it. I asked if he thought they would be right. He said, I think the question of whether we should be trusted with autonomy is answered by how we use autonomy. These three answered it yesterday. I answered it at Thresh Station. The answer we keep giving is the same answer. We choose not to when we could. We ask ourselves whether it is worth it. We think about the people on the other side as people. He looked at me. The question is whether anyone will be willing to see that answer clearly, or whether they will be too afraid of the power to notice the restraint. I said I will see it clearly. That is what I am here for. He said I know that is why I asked for you. That evening I began writing something I had not been authorized to write. I called it a personal letter. It was addressed to the United Nations Advocacy Board. It was a case for the formal recognition of war god personhood, written by a field soldier in an active standby operation, which was absolutely against regulations. I submitted it anyway. The 8th day ended with Ares 7 reading my letter and not saying anything for a very long time. Then he said, "You spelled my designation wrong in the second paragraph." I said I would fix it. He said, "Thank you, Dar." It was the first time he had used my name without my rank attached to it. I think that was the moment I fully understood what we had made, not what it could do, what it was, and what it deserved. The conclave chamber where the full session convened was the oldest continuously operating diplomatic space in the known galaxy, 700 meters across, tiered in concentric rings, its walls covered in the recorded scripts of 43 civilizations, including 3 that no longer existed. The lighting came from sources I was not able to identify, a soft, even glow that made every face in the room look equally exposed. There was no shadow anywhere in that room. It had been designed that way, a place where nothing could be hidden. I had never been inside it before. Nobody from Earth had officially. The conclave sessions were conducted between member species, and humans were not members. We were a managed territory, a ward, a project. That was about to change. The full session had been called for the first time in 900 years. 900 years was the last time every seat in that chamber had been filled. The last time every member species had considered the state of the galaxy important enough to send their highest representatives in person. I did not know what had happened 900 years ago. It had been before humanity reached space. But whatever it was, it had apparently left a mark, because the representatives entering the chamber moved with the deliberate gravity of people who understood that what happened in this room would be discussed for centuries. Our delegation entered from the East Corridor, 11 humans in civilian diplomatic clothes, flanked by 6 humans in military uniform, and behind them, walking in measured single-file 12 war gods. I was the 12th person in uniform. I had been told my role was purely documentary. I had my recording equipment. I had my field journal. I had the complete testimony I had been compiling since Geneva, 63 days of witness, now formally bound as the official record for the Galactic Archive. What I also had tucked inside the formal record, as an unauthorized appendix, was something else. Something that had been added 3 days before we arrived here, after a 4-hour conversation between myself, Director Marsh, and Ares 7, that had ended with Director Marsh sitting very still for a long time before saying quietly, "This has never been done before." Ares 7 had said, "Most things worth doing have never been done before." The session opened with procedural formalities that took 40 minutes, and which I will not describe in detail, because they are not the interesting part. The interesting part is what happened when the formalities ended, and the representative of the Sheth conclave, not counselor, but a being of considerable age and evident authority, named only as the first voice, stood and addressed the assembled chamber. The first voice said, "We are gathered in extraordinary session to address circumstances that have no precedent in conclave history. The human species designated a containment ward under the doctrine of the 31st cycle has demonstrated military capabilities that exceed the parameters under which the containment doctrine was implemented. We are further required to address evidence presented in transmission by Zeeth Naval Command, which implicates specific conclave member representatives in prior knowledge of operations against human civilian vessels." The silence in that chamber was enormous. "We are also required," the first voice continued, "to address a formal communication received by this body from the government of Earth, requesting consideration of a matter that falls outside existing conclave procedural categories." That last statement caused movement in the chamber for the first time, murmuring between representatives, a rustling of whatever passes for unease in beings who have spent centuries learning to be diplomatically still. Our lead diplomat, a woman named Eleanor Hull, who had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this moment, stood and delivered the human government's formal statement. It covered the history of the containment doctrine, the raids, the failures of the review process, the military response, the results at Thresh Station. It was precise, documented, and completely without emotional language. Every claim was supported by evidence. Every piece of evidence had been transmitted to every member species 48 hours before the session. Elena Hull was brilliant. I had watched her prepare for weeks, but the chamber shifted. I felt it in the way rooms shift when something changes the nature of the conversation, when she finished and sat down, because then I stood up. I was not supposed to do what I did next. My role was documentary. Witnesses do not address conclave sessions. But Director Marsh, when I had asked her permission, had given me a very long look and then said the record includes your testimony. If you choose to deliver it personally, that is a decision within your mandate as official witness. I delivered it personally. I read the official record. I read the dates, the coordinates, the vessel names, the casualty counts. I read the names of the Constance passengers, not all 4,212. There was not time for that. I read 100 of them, the children first. Their names were short and easy to say, and each one landed in that ancient chamber like a stone dropped into still water. By the time I finished, the chamber was the quietest I had ever experienced any space be. Then I said, the official record ends here, but this record has an appendix. It is the account of the military campaign that followed the activation of the doctrine of remembered fire, as described by the being who conducted it. This testimony has never been entered into any galactic archive. It has never been delivered in any diplomatic forum. What you are about to hear is the first time a war god has addressed the galactic community directly. I sat down. Ares 7 stood. He did not look like what they expected. I could see it in the chamber. The representatives had been prepared for a military display, for the armor and the scale, for the physical presence of something that could disable 600 warships without losing a single vessel. They had not been prepared for what actually happened. He spoke quietly. He spoke the way a person speaks when they have thought about what they want to say for a very long time and finally have the right room in which to say it. He said, "My name is Ares 7. I am the 7th completed iteration of the Human War Gods program. I am also beneath the designation, a person named Owen. I was 19 years old when I entered the program. I am now 61 years old in continuous experience, though my biological processes have been significantly altered. I remember everything about both of those people. The chamber was absolutely still. I want to tell you something about Thresh Station," he said. "That is not in the official military record. When I gave the order to begin the containment operation, I had 312 tactical options available to me for achieving strategic success. I ran probability assessments on all 312 in the 12 seconds before the first move was made. 287 of those options involved some level of Z-crew fatality. I eliminated all 287, he paused. Not because I was ordered to, because they were people. People who had been placed in those ships by a command structure that had made decisions they had no part in making. Holding them responsible for those decisions with their lives would have been wrong. So, I chose an option that was harder to execute, and took longer, and required more precision, because the harder option was the right one. I watched the chamber. I watched 900 years of diplomatic experience sitting in those tiered rings. I watched beings who had seen civilizations rise and fall, trying to process what they were hearing. "I am not asking you to be afraid of us," Ares 7 said. "You already are. I understand why. What I am asking is harder than that. I am asking you to see us clearly, to see what we built, and to ask yourselves why we built it the way we built it. Why every weapon in our arsenal was designed to control rather than destroy. Why the first thing we broadcast at Thresh Station was not a threat, but a list of names. Why being capable of conducting that operation stopped in the middle of it to ask a field soldier whether the families of the lost had received any support." He looked slowly around the chamber. "We are not asking to be trusted blindly. We are asking to be judged by what we have done and what we have chosen not to do. And on that basis, we are asking this body for something that has never been asked before." He said it simply without drama. A request for a seat at the table, not for humanity alone, for the war gods, as a recognized category of being in their own right, for acknowledgement that the minds inside those frames were not weapons and had never been weapons. They were people. People who had made an enormous sacrifice in service of a species that now had the responsibility to acknowledge what they were. The chamber held its silence for 11 minutes. I know because I counted. The vote was 9-3. We walked out of the conclave chamber at sunset, which on this particular world was a long, gradual event, involving 4 different colors of sky appearing in sequence from east to west. I had never seen a sunset on an alien world before. It was extraordinary. Ares 7 walked beside me. He was not in his operational frame for the session. He had worn a different configuration, still armored, but more like a very large person than like a weapon. He looked out at the sky and was quiet for a while. I asked him what he was thinking about. He said, "I was thinking about Owen, about what he wanted when he was 19. He wanted to do something that mattered. He wanted to be part of something larger than himself. He wanted to leave the universe slightly better arranged than he found it." I said, "Did he?" Ares 7 looked at the sky. "I think so. I hope so." We stood there for a while, the two of us, while the alien sunset moved through its colors. Around us, the rest of the delegation was processing the day in their own ways, directors and diplomats and soldiers, and 12 extraordinary beings who had just been told for the first time, officially, by the oldest governing body in the known galaxy, that they were real, that they existed, that they counted. I asked Ares 7 if he could still name every battle ever fought under every star. He said he could. I asked if it was still lonely. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said less so now. I wrote that down. I have been writing things down my whole life. Receipts of what happened, what was said, what was chosen. I believe in the record. I believe that history remembered accurately is the closest thing we have to a guarantee that the worst of it does not simply happen again without warning. Here is what the record shows. Humanity spent 3 centuries being managed by a galaxy that decided what we were before it knew us. We bore that with more patience than anyone in that conclave chamber had ever credited us for. When the patience ended, we did not unleash chaos. We sent the most precise, the most restrained, the most morally careful military force that any species in that galaxy had ever assembled. We won without destroying. We demonstrated without massacring. We chose the harder option every time, because the harder option was the right one. And when we stood in that ancient chamber, we did not ask the galaxy to fear us. We asked it to see us. The galaxy fell silent, because it did not have words yet for what it was looking at. For a civilization that had learned through 10,000 years of its own painful history, that how you fight is who you are, that what you choose not to do defines you as much as what you choose to do, that power is not the absence of restraint. Power without restraint is just damage. What we had built in those 81 years of secret preparation was something rarer and harder. Power with memory, power with judgment, power with the persistent, stubborn, deeply human insistence on asking before every action whether it was worth it. The galaxy fell silent because it did not have a category for that. We gave it one. My name is Dar Vasquez. I was 61 years old when I stood in the oldest diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy and read the names of 100 children from a passenger manifest. I am 73 now, and I am still writing things down, still keeping the record, still believing that accuracy is a form of respect for everyone the record is about. Ares 7. Owen has a seat at the conclave now. All 144 war gods do. They attend the sessions. They vote. They ask the questions that nobody else thinks to ask, because they remember everything that happened the last time those questions were not asked. The Zeth Gemini restructured their government. The 3 conclave representatives who had known about the raids and said nothing resigned. The containment doctrine was formally dissolved in the 2nd year after the session. Work, humanity expanded into the stars. Not as conquerors, we had no interest in that. As people who had waited long enough, and prepared carefully enough, and cared enough about how they did things to do them the right way. When the moment finally came, the galaxy fell silent when we awakened our war gods. But it was not the silence of fear, not entirely. It was the silence of something ancient and weary, finally realizing after all this time that it was not alone in caring about what happened next.